Center for International Studies here at MIT, and I know it's presumptuous to offer up a report card on the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, but it's not only presumptuous, it's also a tad superfluous, since the only important report card was issued last week during the midterm elections by the voters. That said, it struck many of us that despite 2 wars, despite a global economic crisis, a lot of challenges around the world, that foreign affairs seem to be of so little importance in the election and in the debates around the election. Even immigration policy was framed almost entirely as a domestic issue. So in thinking about how to introduce this panel and this topic, one thing I thought I'd do is look for report cards that were issued by other presumptuous folks. And the first that popped up at me was from a group that called itself a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest group, which a year into, only 1 year into the Obama administration, it reviewed the performance of each federal agency and of the White House itself. And the average grade issued was D-. In fact, energy, EPA, FTC, Interior, immigration naturalization, justice, and transportation, they all got Fs from this group. So I went off looking for other report cards, and Google then directed me to one that assigned only A's and B's, including an A+ on foreign policy. So what I was learning was not much of substance, but an awful lot about the very discouraging quality of political discourse and policy discourse in this country. So what this panel's job then is, clearly, is to elevate the discourse. And that doesn't mean that the Obama administration necessarily will get high marks or necessarily will get low marks, but it'll get thoughtful marks and objective ones, we hope. And they're going to be deep diving into 3 policy areas: foreign policy, particularly Afghanistan, energy and the environment, and the economy. Now, the 3 speakers are each experts in these respective areas. Barry Posen, to my immediate right, is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT and the Director of the Security Studies Program in the Center for International Studies. And atop his current research agenda is his work on U.S. national security policy, and he's going to focus particularly, as I mentioned, on Afghanistan today. After Barry speaks for about 15 minutes, Henry Jacoby, is the William F. Pounds Professor of Management Emeritus at the MIT Sloan School here. He's also co-director of the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. So he'll speak to us about the administration's efforts over the past 2 years in that area. And Simon Johnson is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Sloan School of Management. He served as economic counselor and director of the research department at the IMF from March 2007 until August 2008, and he will evaluate the administration's economic policy in the wake of the global financial crisis. As I've said, we'll take each in turn. Each will speak for 15 minutes, and we expect to have plenty of time for an active and engaged conversation with you all. So let's turn it over to Barry.
I've developed a congenital problem lately, and that is that however much time people tell me to speak for, I invariably write a talk that takes 3 times as long. So I'm not going to take 3 times as long, but when the talk begins to run over, I'm just going to cut it off. Just to telegraph what I would have said if I was able to give the whole talk, I would talk a little bit about why the United States is there. Whenever we have these kinds of meetings, I think it's good to review where we came from and how we got here, and talk about a few factoids about the present situation. Second, what seems to be the administration's strategy for the war. Many of you remember that there was a year-long internal study of what that strategy should be. Third, how that strategy is being implemented in the war at present. Fourth, a little bit of a critique of why I think it's probably not going to work out very well. And then a little critique of my critique to try and defend the administration's strategy just for the sake of balance. But I may not get to that, in which case you can make me do it in questions. And then finally, I'll try and get to that little bit that was telegraphed to you, which is what does this have to do with politics? So let me remind you briefly why the United States is there. You may remember there was a terrible event The al-Qaeda terrorist organization attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001. Their base area was in Afghanistan, and this precipitated the U.S. attack, which had two purposes, one, to fight al-Qaeda, and the second, to punish the Taliban regime for having made a comfortable home for al-Qaeda. Since the United States stayed in Afghanistan after the original attack, new objectives have emerged. One was somewhat diffuse, which is to ensure that Afghanistan not again become a base for al-Qaeda. And second, even more impressionistically, and you will often hear this uttered, that the intervention in Afghanistan today has something to do with Pakistan's security and something to do with preventing radical elements in Pakistan from getting hold of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Now, when thinking about the Obama administration, we should remember that during the last 2 years of the Bush administration, as the situation in Afghanistan deteriorated, Democrats, at least many Democrat foreign policy analysts and politicians, and the President viewed Afghanistan as the right war, in contrast to Iraq, which was viewed as the wrong war. And the Obama administration quickly invested more resources in Afghanistan after taking office, even before they did their strategic review. So shortly after they took office, they agreed to add 20,000 troops to the troops that were already there. President Bush had just decided to add 10,000 before he left office, so we quickly went from 30 to 60,000 without any kind of a significant rethink. In December of 2009, the President, after this lengthy strategy review, announced a plan to add another 35,000 troops or so, most of which are presently there. America's non-Afghan allies contribute about 40,000 troops to the effort, with the United Kingdom being the biggest contributor. Crudely speaking, in Iraq and Afghanistan, it seems to cost us about $1 million a soldier to keep a soldier in the fight. So crudely speaking, we will soon be spending, or are now spending, roughly $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. The sadder costs of the war, the U.S. has lost almost 1,400 dead in the war. Our non-Afghan allies, about whom I often complain, but not in this case, lost another 800, so they've made their contribution. There are almost 7,000 U.S. wounded. 7,000 or 8,000 Afghan soldiers and police have been killed since 2003, and at least since 2007, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 civilians have been killed, many, if not most, by the Taliban, at least as I understand it. So the President's, now to the strategy review. The President's strategy review, which took much of 2009, was fraught with controversy. The public discussion of that controversy focuses on the troop levels, i.e. that the President somehow wanted 30,000 troops and the Pentagon wanted 40,000 troops. This is obviously nonsense. It wasn't the main issue. The main issue, I think, was strategy and basically ultimate objectives, timelines, and the patterns of military operations in a country. To the extent that one can discern a difference, it was whether or not Afghanistan should be viewed as a relatively open-ended project aiming at defeating the Taliban, developing a very effective Afghan military and police, and a very legitimate and competent government, towards a condition-based disengagement, i.e. we will disengage on success. That's the Pentagon's view. The President's view seems to have been something else, although it's not exactly clear what to me. It seems to be as good a job as we can do within the people and dollar constraints that I'm willing to commit. And those people and dollar constraints allow significant commitment, but not an open-ended one. So I think the key indicator is the review that's planned for July 2011 and the President's commitment that a forced drawdown would start in 2011 or 2012, something like that. He's committed to that drawdown, right, that it will start. What he's not committed to is a rate, right? So now the war strategy at present. Well, the war strategy at present has the same summary as the Iraq war strategy had. The counterinsurgency strategy, people, when they're looking for simple explanations for what they're doing, they have one. And in this case, it's clear, hold, and build. And what does that mean in this context? First, it means to break and reverse the Taliban's momentum. Things have been going in their favor for the last couple of years. They've spread their control and their activities to many more provinces. They've been consolidating their hold in those provinces. And our first task, or the Americans' first task, was to try and reverse this momentum and try and get it going the other way. And the first response is basically military, mainly in the south and east. Some of the operations look like conventional operations. You go into a place in what looks like an offensive. You try and drive the adversary out. Having driven the adversary out, you homestead to try and keep the adversary from coming back. This is the counterinsurgency strategy that says you must protect the population, right? Some counterinsurgency strategists use, I think, the more honest term, control the population. But whatever it is, they're trying to control the population. This has been accompanied by a semi-covert offensive program, mainly conducted by special operators in the intelligence world, to find, kill, or incarcerate Taliban leaders. And depending on who you believe, this program has been moderately successful or wildly successful or not very successful. There definitely are people who have been captured and people who have been killed. How important they are and what percentage of the adversary they encompass is anybody's guess. Now, the goal here is to put a lot of pressure on the Taliban in the hope that some individuals will either leave the organization or stop joining, but more importantly, that leaders will somehow realize that they're not going to win, and the disparate leaders of the Taliban and the disparate groups that make up the Taliban will somehow come to believe that they should lie down their arms, make some sort of a political deal, accept the Afghan constitution, at least for long enough for the Americans to leave. So that's the military part of it. The second part of it is the part that involves recruiting and training an Afghan army and national police that could hold areas as the U.S. begins to disengage. The third is to develop an Afghan political and state apparatus that is legitimate enough to capture the loyalty of the population in the areas cleared and held, and competent enough to administer those areas in a way that doesn't make the Taliban the preferred government. Now, it's one thing I think is worth noting about the President is the President does seem to have a conception of what at least is a kind of an analog to moral hazard. I think the President agrees if you give locals an open-ended commitment, they're not going to pull up their socks and do what they need to do to help themselves. So I think the President likes this idea of some kind of a date certain to begin a disengagement in order to credibly convey to the Afghans, mainly the Karzai government, that they better stand up. Now, if you follow the papers in the last couple of days, suddenly we have dates, right? And the dates that have emerged in the newspapers in the last couple of days is a 4-year plan, so that U.S. and coalition troops would more or less have handed over most duties to the Afghan military by the end of 2014. And if this 4 to 5 year timeline looks familiar to you, it's probably not a surprise. It's quite similar to the kind of timeline that was established on Iraq. I think the timeline itself gives the President a lot of political cover. Let me say a few words about what I think is wrong with this story. First, the Afghan government and administration is unlikely to improve much. It seems like every day or every week or every month we're treated to a new story, either about corruption of the political process or just plain corruption or administrative incompetence, right? And we've been circling this problem for several years now, and there's really not much evidence of progress, and the administration has tried coercion and cajolery with Karzai. Neither seems to have actually worked. So the part of this project that tries to establish a government that can compete with the Taliban is probably not going to work very well. There's no evidence that it's working very well. Second, on Afghan security forces, there was just a report that came out the other day from NATO. There's been a little bit of progress, mostly, I think, due to the fact that we gave everybody a raise. And given that there are not many jobs in Afghanistan, hoisting a pike or hoisting a Kalashnikov is a reasonable way to make a living for what's a martial culture in any case. So recruiting is up and retention is up. But there's still a big problem with illiteracy, especially in the enlisted and the non-commissioned officer ranks. And with the illiterate non-commissioned officers, you're going to have a problem achieving very high levels of competence. There's probably ethnic rivalry within the forces, although the U.S. government doesn't like to talk about it very much. It seems logical that there is some. There's still corruption in the police, probably a lot. The training effort, though it's well-resourced financially, has had trouble recruiting individuals to act as trainers from the various supporting countries, from the coalition countries. There's lots of promises of experts to come and train, but many fewer turn up, right? And that was admitted in this new NATO report. And finally, there's a problem with when the U.S. trains a military force while a fight is going on. And I think we've seen this problem several times, including the Vietnam War. And it seems that when the U.S. is doing this, you have this problem, which is you can't really afford to let your ally fail because you're going to get hurt if your ally does fail. So your ally is typically fighting under your wing, and it's easy for them to become habituated to fighting under your wing. And how you take your hand off the bicycle and let them ride the bicycle themselves and what it's going to be like to make that transition, it's very hard to practice that. So I think you come to a moment of truth where you just have to have faith and let go. Footnote, there are new reports on the Iraq military that suggest the Iraqi military, which the U.S. trained up and organized in this way, is essentially suffering some recidivism. It's starting to go backward because the American forces are not there holding their hands the way they once did. Degrading the Taliban. Many analysts doubt that the organization can be killed off faster than it regenerates. Though U.S. intelligence and special forces are killing Taliban fighters and leaders, they may not be getting at the hearts and brains of the organization. As we know, we tried this strategy in Iraq. We did kill and incarcerate a lot of bad guys, but somehow there's still a lot of bad guys left who, if you read the newspapers every week, manage to find a way to kill or bomb somebody in Iraq. So getting to the core of these organizations destroy them very hard. Second, there are sanctuaries for this organization in Pakistan. The Taliban are mainly Pashtuns. They have co-ethnics on the other side of the border who support them and help them recover. Just about everybody seems to agree that Pakistani security services seem to help the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, in some way. You know, it could be through cutouts, through third parties. Who knows? It's all very murky. But I read the expert literature on this. I'm not an expert myself, but I read the expert literature on this, and I find it more and more to be a kind of an accepted fact that this is the case, although no one really has a smoking gun. The Taliban have deep roots in Pashtun society, which allows them to find new recruits there, new leaders and new soldiers. Right? So all this probably means that this project to weaken them so much that they're going to come in out of the cold or agree to make a deal that they think is inimical to their interests, I think is probably not going to work. Then we get to the negotiations themselves. There apparently have been some contacts. There's not much evidence the Taliban are ready to sign any agreement on terms that would be consistent with our hopes and dreams. Given that the Taliban themselves have deep roots in this society, and given that being armed or disarmed is usually a matter of going to your basement or your root cellar in Afghanistan, it seems to me that the Taliban really cannot credibly commit to any agreement that they would sign. In other words, why would we believe that they were actually going to keep the agreement after the Americans left? And I think if and as we ever get into serious negotiations with them, we're suddenly going to realize that we don't have an easy way to control their potential for defection. Finally, the Taliban, as I said, is not a particularly cohesive organization. There's 2 or 3 or 4 or more main groups, depending on who you believe. It's not clear that all groups will agree at the same time, that all the groups will agree to the same terms, or even that subordinates will agree. Right? So it's not even clear that there's anybody who can really deliver on the other side. We were joking about this the other day, but I have a finally, because it's often forgotten. Pakistan and other countries in the region have a stake in what the deal looks like. And it's not exactly clear what Pakistan wants, but unless they're satisfied, they're not going to support a deal, and they have the ability to stop it. So on balance, I don't think this strategy is likely to produce a great success or a stable outcome. Now, I have some things that I could say that sort of support the position a little bit, but I think I'll just hold those until the Q&A and just cut to the, my conclusion and then the politics of the matter so we can get on to other panelists. I think the project looks like a costly, lengthy, kind of a gamble to try and come up with an outcome in Afghanistan that has the look and feel of a victory, whether or not it actually is a victory, whether or not you'd actually even know what a victory is in this situation. I think there's a premium on how the thing looks. I mean, no American government wants to appear to have lost the war, and no American president or political party wants to appear in the light of the other party as having been the ones that lost the war, who could be later condemned for losing the war. And I think this cuts to the politics of the next couple years. Democrats are going to be quite concerned not to appear to be the authors of a defeat, right? So my guess is that whatever drawdown of forces the president starts, and I believe there will be one, it will be small. The easiest thing for him to do is, in the first instance, to start with the last surge of forces, the last 30,000 that he put in. So I think the first thing that's going to happen is that 30,000 is going to go out, and they may be able to stretch that out till the next election, right? So the president will be able to turn to his Democratic Party constituents and say, I'm getting out, and turn to the Republicans and say, look, or the centrists and say, I'm getting out prudently. It seems likely the Republicans are going to criticize any drawdowns no matter what, right? And I think that's just a given, but I think the president sort of has control of the faucet, so I think maybe he can deal with that. Finally, I think we have to think about wild cards here. I mean, there's a tendency to think about things as if everything else is fixed, and it's not. Pakistan is not fixed, Iran is not fixed, Iraq is not fixed. Things could happen in any of those places to interrupt these plans. And similarly, there's the terrorists, which is to say Al-Qaeda as we know it, as well as Pakistani groups, some of whom seem to be dipping a finger in international terrorism. Any kind of successful action by any of these people can change the whole dimensions of things. At least there's been leaked documents that suggest that we have told the Pakistani government that in the unhappy event that an actual successful terrorist attack of the United States originates in Pakistan, and we suspect that the ISI or Pakistani intelligence could have done something about it and didn't, or should have done something about it, there could be a pretty significant American reaction, military reaction. If that happens, all bets are going to be off in the region.
Okay. Well, first, let me say a few words to set the context. I mean, this question about Obama performance in the climate area. I mean, does it really matter? I mean, should we care? And I thought I would just start with a couple of points to put us all on the same page about that, or if not all on the same page, at least you know which page I'm on. And that is that the climate is changing, and although there's a lot of uncertainty about it, there's the forecasts for future change are a serious concern, and although there's, once again, uncertainty about how much is due to human influence, there's some sound evidence that all or most, or at least most of it, is due to human influence, a major contributor, and that the potential social, economic, and even security implications of this are really quite serious. Next, it's a global challenge. Everybody has, a large number of nations has to participate, but we're not going to get anywhere until the United States takes some kind of action. And cutting U.S. emissions is not an exercise that would do significant damage to the economic growth rate of the United States. I'm happy to discuss any of those points, but that's where I start. But after that last point, I say, but the effort to do something about this issue, to control greenhouse gas emissions, it raises serious issues in two other areas that create the problem. First of all, it has substantial distributional implications within the country, which is a big part of the problem. Distribution by region and by industry. My best example of that is, if you didn't see it, I hope you saw it on TV, the spot by Governor Manchin of West Virginia in his Senate advertisement, where he loads his hunting rifle and shoots a hole in a mock-up of a cap-and-trade bill. He's a Democrat, by the way. And he finishes and he says, and he turns to the camera and he says, cap-and-trade is not in the interest of West Virginia. And the trouble is, he's right. It's not in the interest of West Virginia, which is a major coal-producing state. So the distributional implications are quite a bit of problem. The other thing is that in the U.S., to do something about this involves increased government involvement in energy markets. Whatever we do, you have to do that. So under the best of circumstances, legislation to deal with emissions in the United States is going to be difficult, and it's going to be messy. Winners and losers, problems of compensation, and the politics of government intervention are all too obvious this week. So what grade to give the administration for what they've tried to do in this area? And my view is that A, B, C, F, those are not the right letters for this kind of exercise. So I have reverted to section 2.64 of the Rules and Regulations of the Faculty of MIT, where there is a grade called IE, which is incomplete due to disruption. Now I'm courting trouble with my son Daniel, who's a history teacher, who says to me, Dad, it's a fool's errand to go out and to pick some happening in the past and then say, well, if that hadn't happened, the world would be different after that. You know, if Archduke Ferdinand had just stayed in bed that day, we could have avoided the First World War. You know, that kind of problem. But so I'm in trouble with my son. But what I'm going to say is, that without the financial crisis and the recession that we've gone, we might well have done something substantial in this area, and we did have a House bill. Passed the Waxman-Markey bill, passed the House. We had a substantial effort with a little bit of Republican support by Senator Graham, along with Senators Lieberman and Kerry, and they had another bill which tried to deal with all these issues of compensation, distribution, and the like. And there was a potential there, and those both were bills that attempted to approach the nation as a whole, to apply a cap and trade system, to use a price mechanism to deal with this. They were necessarily messy, but they were, I think, a good attempt to deal with this in an economically rational way. The recession makes imposing those costs that would have to be imposed and the distribution implications. It makes it very, very difficult. What about the administration's response to this? Well, I think, unfortunately, the administration has contributed to the unfavorable environment and has made decisions that hurt the prospects for progress in this area. The main decision that was made was to put health care first. I mean, they could have started off with the health of the people. They could have started off with the health of the planet. They were both in the hopper. They chose the health of the people, and so, having made that political judgment, the rest of it for climate was going to be difficult. And you see this when the Senate bill came along, and to some critical moments about whether it actually would get through committees and into the floor. The White House and the key people in the administration, I think, are widely viewed as wimping out. They didn't really support that and didn't put the muscle into it it might have been done. Now, who knows what would have happened? Once again, to my son's view, maybe if we'd taken climate first, maybe today we'd have a big movement in the Congress to repeal the climate bill instead of the health bill. But still, it might have been better. The other thing I would say about how the administration has not helped is and this is more of a concern, I think, is I'm concerned they've given the pulpit over to the people against action and to the deniers. So you have a statement in the Contract for America by the Republican Party which says, reject cap and trade. This is item 2 of the contract. Stop costly new regulations that would increase unemployment, raise consumer prices, and weaken the nation's global competitiveness with virtually no impact on global temperatures. It's a point we can discuss. It absolutely misses the point about what the issue is here and what needs to be done. And if you look at the Senate, there's a collection of statements by senators, particularly Republican senators, essentially denying the attribution point. They will say, well, maybe the climate's changing, but there's no proof that humans are causing it. And therefore, since there's no proof that humans are causing it, then we should not take measures that presumably are going to destroy the economy. And I think that's had a substantial effect on public views of this issue. And my concern about this is that we get to this situation where we have a new word. You know, we now have the C word. I mean, the word carbon is not said in polite company now, and the word carbon is not going to be said in Washington for some period of time. And my concern is that the administration, for whatever political reasons, has kind of given over the pulpit and has not done the teaching job that might have been done to counter what I think is an incorrect perception of this issue, which is given a lot of attention in the country now. What are the implications of this? International negotiations will continue in deadlock. We're headed to a meeting in Cancun of the Framework Convention of Climate Change, where people are trying to avoid disaster. If you read the New York Times this morning, you can see the kind of urgent attempt to find something to do. Our old colleague Mario Molina, who was an MIT faculty member and won the Nobel Prize for work on the ozone-depleting gases, is putting forth the idea that maybe we can include hydrofluorocarbons, which is a small component of this problem. Maybe we can include it under the Montreal Protocol, looking for something to do to make some progress. Otherwise, we're totally deadlocked in that area. I think if the United States had wanted leadership in this issue, and the way that President Obama behaved in Copenhagen, it looked like we wanted to have leadership in this issue. I think that is gone. We just are not. I would not want to be in the position of our negotiators who go to Cancun to negotiate with other people about this, given the situation that the administration is in. So, if it's an incomplete in the report card, what do we watch for in what's coming now? Well, we have the Environmental Protection Agency. Due to a Supreme Court decision a few years ago that declared carbon dioxide to be a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, along with other aspects of air pollution, mercury, sulfur dioxide, NOx, toxics, and the like, included CO2 as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. Once that happens, then it starts a process. Once it starts a process within the Clean Air Act, and that process begins with a declaration of danger and the EPA has done that. It's being there are suits against it, but a certain declaration that it is a problem under the Act, and then they are obligated to take measures to constrain CO2 emissions. And there are things going on that could have some effect on CO2 emissions, particularly the application of standards to coal-fired power plants that would force them into some sort of a best available control technology or something like that. And that's coming along, and that probably will appear sometime after the first of the year. And there also is going on in the EPA a tightening of a number of air pollution regulations, mercury, NOx, toxics, and the like, that would also have an effect of making certain of the nastier coal-fired power plants uneconomic. So that would have an effect. Something would take place if that happened, and it is in fact the case that we have a lot of excess capacity in natural gas in the United States. Natural gas is not as carbon producing as coal, about half, and we could in fact retire a number of coal-fired plants and meet the demand with natural gas if we decided to do this. But remember who won the election and the number of states in the United States that produce coal. So we don't know what the administration will do, how hard they will push in this area, and we don't know what the Congress is going to do, because there are moves in the Congress to remove this power from the Environmental Protection Agency, to take this regulatory authority away in this area, which they could do by legislation. And the thing that you need to watch, I think I want to watch, is what's going to happen. Of course, the Republicans want a number of the Republicans want to repeal or remove the power of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate CO2 or to tighten these other air toxics and other things. They, of course, can't do that because they don't control the Senate, and, of course, the President could veto anything. But what I don't know and what we have to watch is whether we may have another kind of a fight take place. There's a lot of talk in the news about the health bill, about the fact that the House of Representatives, people in the House who want to repeal the health bill, may then, since they can't repeal the bill, they can attack the ability of the federal agency to implement the bill. So there's a lot of talk about that. Nobody's talking about the climate area, but another potential development is to try to cripple the EPA through the budget process. Now, one of the things that we have to watch is what kind of position will the administration take on this? Will they fight for this? There is also a possibility of some legislation on subsidies to various kinds of energy, clean energy, regulatory things, not focused on greenhouse gas emissions, but focused on energy policy, perhaps some, but it's bits and pieces. And all I can say is that the notion that we approach this kind of issue through these kind of regulatory processes, through subsidies and the like, is really almost the worst imaginable way to deal with this issue, in that it is likely to be much more costly than it would be with a more economically based policy. And you lose the way to ameliorate the distributional effects, which you can do with the cap-and-trade system or a tax system and the like. Of course, it has the great advantage politically that it hides the cost to do it this way. So what is the outlook? Dark. Expectations for the ultimate grade is not good, I'm afraid. We can hope for economic recovery, which would allow a greater focus on this issue. I think it's this issue is very hard to get any air in the midst of the economic situation. We can wait for the next election. It's possible things could change with the election. But I think that at least for this round of negotiations, for this period of this administration and stuff, the opportunity for the United States to take the kind of step that would put us in a leadership position has gone by. And as someone who works on this every day, if you believe that's the case, they always raise the question about how do you get up in the morning. And the answer is this is not a 5-year problem. This is a century scale problem. We're going to be at this for all of my lifetime and all of your lifetimes dealing with this. So if we didn't win it this time, it's really important to stay with it and see if we can't do better next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a great honor to be here. That was my punchline with regard to the banking system. It's a 100-year problem. You just took it from me. Well. So my job is to talk about the economic policies of this administration, and I find myself, and we all find ourselves in this, I think, rather strange position in this regard. Remember, and I'm sure you do remember, because it was an intense experience for everyone who was paying any kind of attention. In September 2008, in the United States, around us, we had the worst financial crisis since 1929 breakout. This was for real. There's, the stories that you remember are not imagined. You can go see this very good movie that just came out, made by Charles Ferguson, a graduate at MIT, called Inside Job. He'll take you back, reconstruct the sequence of events there, and lay out the main issues and the personalities. It's all correct. This was a huge crisis. This was a meltdown of our financial system and actually the global financial system. And this was, of course, the moment when then Senator Obama pulled ahead of Senator McCain because he seemed very calm, very much in control of the facts. He built a team that initially created a good impression. And the bottom line, if we were grading just on, if this was a purely quantitative multiple choice type test, choice A, Great Depression, repeats. Choice B, no Great Depression. Well, we averted a Great Depression. And I have to emphasize that is a terrific achievement, and one we should all be happy about. But I'm still giving out failing grades. So what's that about? And so do the midterm voters, as Dick said, which is more important, I think. And the prospects for 2012 do not look particularly encouraging for reasons we can talk about. So how can we have this dissonance between depression averted under the most awful circumstances and disappointing something? Well, partly, let's be frank, partly this is us as human beings being swayed by the emotions around us and being swayed by 8 million jobs lost. There's a cycle. There is a very difficult, painful cycle whenever there's a financial crisis, and jobs do not come back in the United States like they used to. In any recession, we can talk about that, and they particularly never come back in any country around the world when you blow up the banking system. That is always a long, slow, painful recovery. Right? So let's get that straight right out in the open, and everything I say, and this clouds my own emotions too, my own assessment, and certainly what happens at the polls. But in any crisis, and as Dick said, I used to work at the IMF. I was chief economist there for a while. I worked at the IMF for about 4 out of the last 6 years. I will tell you, I claim, the sorts of things the IMF would say to the U.S. government if it could speak truth to authority in the United States, which it can't. In any financial crisis, there are 3 policies on the table, 3 central policies to preventing terrible outcomes and trying to get a reasonable recovery. The first is what you do directly with regard to the financial system. Let's call that banking policy. The second is what you do with regard to the government budget, fiscal policy. And the third is what you do with regard to monetary policy. Now, monetary policy is, in the United States, the responsibility of the Federal Reserve, and we can have a long discussion about Ben Bernanke and his performance. There are many reasons to worry about what the Federal Reserve did before 2008 and what it is doing now. But in terms of the measures taken once the crisis broke intensely in fall 2008 and going, let's say, for a year or a year and a half afterwards, the Fed did very well. The Fed and the Fed policies and the sorts of things that actually Ben Bernanke wrote about in his thesis at MIT, it turns out, all turned out to be important contributions to averting that disaster. And that's not part of the Obama report card, although President Obama did reappoint Mr. Bernanke, a point I'll come back to in a little bit later. So the main responsibility of the Obama administration was banking policy and fiscal policy. And the reason I have problems with what they've done is very little to do with fiscal policy. On the fiscal side, in terms of providing a fiscal stimulus, using the budget to push back against the contractionary forces that hit any economy when there's a massive financial shock, you know, there's no perfect answer to how big a stimulus you should do, what kind of stimulus you should do. We can argue, should it have been a little more tax cut, a little more stimulus spending here or there? Doesn't really matter. In terms of the main, using the government balance sheet to counter the effects of the banking disaster, the Bush administration actually had a stimulus package in early 2008 that was reasonable, and the Obama administration's package in early 2009 was also reasonable. Now, I'm sorry if that upsets some people from certain parts of the political spectrum in the room. If you want to discuss fiscal policy, I'll come on and try and make a few points about that later on. I am delighted to. I can assure you that no one is more in favor of fiscal responsibility in the United States than I am. I currently campaign very hard. I run a website on global economic issues called Baseline Scenario. I testify to Congress fairly often, and I write in other places advocating very strongly for medium-term fiscal consolidation, bringing the budget deficit under control, and getting the debt down to a reasonable level. And at least as I see it, there is nobody on the right or the left in the political spectrum in the United States right now who is sufficiently serious about fiscal responsibility. Now, having said that, you have a massive crisis, you have an enormous shock, you have some fiscal space, you should use it. Okay? On this point, the administration and the administration's people, including Larry Summers, were exactly right. Now, they didn't communicate it well. They didn't do a lot of follow-up. Their messaging around this issue and other economic issues has undoubtedly been poor. And they let themselves get outmaneuvered badly in the midterm elections on this. And I think this may go badly for them going into 2012, although there are very interesting divisions within the Republican Party on this issue, very substantive divisions that I think are going to come back to cause them difficulties too. But on fiscal policy, look, you have a massive crisis. What do you want? Do you want another depression? Do you want to go through a version of the 1930s again? No, of course you don't. You have to use the means that are available. And it is very hard to find fault with people under intense pressure facing these stark alternatives. But there is a problem. There's a very big problem, I'm afraid, with what the Obama administration has done in economic terms. And that is in banking policy. Now, if you have a banking crisis, if your major banks are in trouble, if they are potentially or actually insolvent, and any country around the world is forced to bring in the IMF, and I can assure you nobody ever wants to bring in the IMF with good reason. You know, it is painful. It is difficult. The IMF will tell you things you don't want to hear, and one of the things they'll say to you is, you've got to close down some of these banks. You have to fire some management. You have to change boards of directors. Whatever you do, you cannot, according to the IMF, provide these banks with an unconditional bailout. Why? Well, what would be wrong with that? Just throw money at the problem. If you have the money, refloat all the banks. Well, it will actually work, by the way. If you can get the money, if the IMF will lend you the money, or if you're in the European context today, if the European Union or the Eurozone or Germany will lend you the money, you can put the banks back on their feet. There's an issue in Ireland today, for example. But putting them back, and so you will have a positive short-term effect. But that is just rewarding them for bad behavior, for managing their risks inappropriately, for taking all kinds of bad decisions. And the best practice is absolutely to at least fire management, at least fire directors, almost always to wipe out some shareholders and not nationalize the banks in terms of take them over and run them as state enterprises. Again, the IMF would never suggest that you do that, but wiping out existing shareholders and selling off the viable parts of the bank as quickly as you can going forward. Again, best practice. Not only that, but Mr. Summers, when he was at the Treasury in the 1990s, and Mr. Geithner also when he was at Treasury in the 1990s, and other people who've worked around them then and work around them now, they insisted when Asia was in trouble in the 1990s that this be part of the IMF policies. And to be honest, the policy mistake made in the 1990s, the mistaken recommendation of US Treasury and of the IMF was on the fiscal side. They didn't use the fiscal balance sheet, for example, in Korea to counteract the financial crisis. On the banking side, on the side of do you reward the people at the center of the bad decisions, on that point, the Treasury was right in the Larry Summers and his colleagues were right in the 1990s, and they were wrong in early 2009. Now, interestingly and ironically, this has really come back to haunt them. In a sense, I think they felt they would get away with this, that this would, and you know, perhaps their intentions were pure, perhaps they thought this would help the economy recover quicker. I'm skeptical of that. As I said, this is not best practice for a reason. But they presented themselves, they saw themselves as what they like to call themselves the responsible adults. And they said that the people who were opposed to them, the people who were in favor of the standard practice for distressed banks at the center of the system, that such people were populists, that they had pitchforks, and that they were being irresponsible. Well, that's me. Now, I've looked carefully throughout my personal belongings. I can't find a pitchfork. I'm, again, former chief economist of the IMF. I'm not a radical of right or left. They have a test at the IMF to screen out radicals of right and left, and I did very well on that test. The gamble was that this would refloat the economy, the jobs would come back, everyone would get over it. And particularly because the jobs didn't come back, and particularly because it's not a populist as in people who don't understand anything reaction. It's a populist as in many people who are not in government and not running these big banks understand what the banks got away with. And they're shocked by it. Most of my colleagues in economics, in the economics field, in the business school field, most of the people I work part-time at a think tank in Washington, a very mainstream, middle-of-the-road set of people are shocked by what happened. I talk a lot to people in the business community. Non-financial people are shocked. People in the financial sector who don't work at and control the big banks are shocked. People who used to work at the big banks are the most shocked of all. And what did the financial sector do when it got back on its feet? See, the administration said, well, look, we'll save you now, and we'll do financial reform down the road. You know, there's a time inconsistency problem there. Once the banks are back on their feet, once they have the power, they can block you on the financial reform. Again, that's why it's not best practice to do this. And the banks got back on their feet. They repaid the government a lot of the capital that had been injected, they're removing themselves from any kind of restriction. And they proceeded to fight very hard against the administration's efforts, which I think were somewhat half-hearted to start with, but they were definitely making an effort to rein in the dangers posed by these banks going forward. And on issue after issue, point after point, the banks undermined financial reform. The administration didn't fight hard enough. The bill that came out of the House at the end of 2009 was weak, against all the odds, and partly because Paul Volcker got involved and said, no, this is not going well, we've got to get more serious. Paul Volcker, by the way, again, not a radical of left or right. The debate in the Senate became more heated, more pointed, and there were opportunities to strengthen the legislation. And Mr. Volcker was available. Mr. Volcker did push hard, and I'm afraid the administration didn't follow through. Again and again, they've ceded ground to the banks. Now, the big mistake was at the beginning. Much of the logic has flown from that. The administration is being blamed for many things, partly because unemployment hasn't come back, and we should recognize that. But on the fundamental issue, did they fix the banks? Did they seize the opportunity? Did they deal with the underlying issues which contributed to 2008 and which going forward are horrible around the fact that banks are too big to fail? The biggest banks cannot fail in this economy. And they have not addressed that problem. They have not, in the so-called Dodd-Frank legislation, ended up with anything that makes it possible for a global mega bank, a JP Morgan Chase, a Goldman Sachs, a Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. These banks cannot fail. They can fail only in the sense that Lehman failed. They can do the bankruptcy. They can do the collapse. But that's what gives you the catastrophe. And that's what gives them power in that situation to get another bailout. So we find ourselves in this very awkward and unpleasant position that the financial sector is back. And I'm not an anti-finance person. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Sloan, among other things. I'm very pro-business. I'm very pro-finance. I'm just against having a few banks with excessive power. And actually, Gene Farmer, who's the father of the efficient markets view of finance, said it best. He said, too big to fail is not a market. It's a government subsidy scheme. It's an abomination and it should stop. And the administration failed on that fundamental task in the context of financial crisis. Now, this won't, let me be clear, this will not prevent a recovery. If unemployment comes down fast enough, the president has a good chance for 2012. The Republicans are badly split on fundamental issues and very, very confused on fundamental issues around fiscal policy. And if this is used to the Democrats' advantage, I think the president also has a chance. But by saving the banks in this form, by building this implicit subsidy scheme into the structures in which these banks survive, this administration is responsible for setting us up for very serious trouble down the road. They failed on their domestic attempts to deal with that. They failed in the initial attempts. They failed in the legislation. They failed at the G20 level. They failed at the Basel process level in terms of capital standards. The outlook in terms of what the financial sector will do, the risks it will take, and the damage it will cause going forward are very bleak. And that is why, for me at least, with regard to the policies around the crisis, I remain very disappointed and give them a low grade, whatever that is in this context.
Well, thank you all very much. For those of you who are not either weeping or too depressed to engage in a larger conversation, we invite you to come to the microphones and identify yourself first, please. And we'll go back and forth like we'll do a little ping pong here. Sir?
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Stacy Hawkins from the Sloan School of Management, and my question is to Professor Posen. Sir, I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether the confirmed killing or capture of Osama bin Laden would have a stabilizing or destabilizing effect on the South Asia region.
You just want?
Yeah, we'll take them one at a time.
I guess I don't think it matters very much to the South Asian region. I think the killing or capturing of Osama bin Laden matters a lot, I think, to the United States, and still should matter to the United States. And I have to say I have grave doubts about our relationship with Pakistan, given that I happen to simply believe that if the Pakistanis wanted to catch him, they could, right? And I think it indicates a deep and fundamental problem in our relationship that's going to come back to haunt us. But I don't think if Osama went away, the United States would instantaneously decide that they were done in Afghanistan. They would still be concerned about that organization called Al-Qaeda. The intelligence community has pictures. They have their network diagrams of all the people who are involved, and their worst case is going to be that killing Osama doesn't change the threat very much. So on balance, unfortunately, I don't think it changes very much in the region.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Richard Gordon from University of Manitoba, visiting in the Camera Culture Group. This is for Dr. Posen. I work with many young Afghans delivering books to the universities in Afghanistan. And my general impression of them is that almost all are very strongly against the Taliban, and I think would would figure very strongly in what the future of the country is going to be, irregardless of what the U.S. does. You have not discussed, except for the regime, the Karzai regime, anything about what the Afghans themselves might do in the near future.
Well, I think, I didn't get to the part of the conversation where I would have said something about why there's a chance to achieve something in Afghanistan. And I think one thing we should remember is that the Taliban are embedded in the Pashtun population, and the Afghan Pashtun population is about 40–45% of Afghanistan. So they have plenty of enemies. Second of all, people who study the movement, study the Taliban movement and its position in the Pashtun community, seem to believe that the Pashtun community in Afghanistan is itself somewhat riven between those Pashtuns who are more urbanized and more modern and those in the countryside that are more traditional. And it is said, though I cannot be sure, that the Taliban's roots go deeper into that rural population. Unfortunately, this leaves a big chunk of Afghanistan where the Taliban can work well, but that's not the same as saying that they're loved. The Afghan population has had an experience with Taliban government. It wasn't necessarily fun. It wasn't necessarily pretty. And we should understand that the Taliban were on the ropes for several years after the U.S. invasion in 2003. The question we have to ask is why and how did the Taliban come back? And the Taliban came back because they're a cohesive, well-organized group with a program and a willingness to kill and die for their cause. The central government that we've helped create is just not very effective in the regions where the Taliban can operate with the most freedom of action. So the Taliban, I think, is a second best solution for many of these people, but the first best solution is not open to them. Right? So I don't think if the Americans left that the Taliban would necessarily charge into Kabul and exercise its writ all over the country. And that's particularly unlikely if the Americans continued to provide assistance, covert or overt, to the other groups in Afghanistan who would oppose them. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful not to focus only on the answers we hear from various sectors of Afghan society that are most consistent with our liberal values. Those are the people we talk to, so those are the answers we hear. There are people we don't talk to much, we don't hear their answers. And those people have managed, while we were present in the country, while the regime had all kinds of assistance from us, to assert some kind of presence through much of the country, even the northern parts of the country where they were very weak after the war. So I think we have to treat this adversary with a modicum of respect. I think we have to treat our friends and allies with a good bit of skepticism.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jimmy Wong. My question is for Dr. Posen. It seems that there might be a change.
This is going to be the last one he gets in a row.
It seems there might be a change in leadership at the Department of Defense, perhaps before 2012. And if there is a change, I'm curious to hear what you think. What might change substantively on the ground in Afghanistan, Iraq, or is it really just kind of a political cover for drawdown? Thank you.
I don't think a change in the leadership at the top will make much difference in the short to medium term. I think it's possible that it will make a difference in the degree of Pentagon support for the President's view of this thing rather than the current view of this thing, which I think many in the military and in the Pentagon still have. And what I mean by that is what I spoke to in my remarks, which is I think the Pentagon, at least Gates and some of the senior military, for whatever reasons, have a more open-ended notion of what this conflict is about and how it should be fought. Petraeus himself is on record more or less as saying that he believes, this is not a very nice way to put it, but it sure reads this way, that he sort of believes in endless war, right, as far as this struggle with whether you call it terrorism or instability or anti-system parties or whatever, that he expects the Americans to be involved in wars like this more or less on an open-ended basis. And he believes we should stay in Afghanistan somehow as long as it takes. It's very surprising to me since I actually knew him as a student. When he was at Princeton, I was a junior professor. I actually knew him, and he actually took courses from me. He's a smart guy. So I find it odd that he believes these things. In the large, however...
Oh, you know students.
It's true. It's like that song by Sting, Message in a Bottle. You don't know what beach they're going to wash up on. I mean... So, what was I saying before I digressed? I do think that there are people who might be appointed to this job at the civilian level who do not believe in endless war, who think that the counterinsurgency projects should be wound up and that the capabilities built for those should be gradually cut back, particularly given that the Pentagon doesn't have open-ended budget increases in front of it. It may not suffer decreases, but everything else that continues to grow in cost. So keeping alive relatively large ground forces tailored for counterinsurgency is going to be at the cost of your modernization in naval power and air power. And if you look at the pattern of the president's get-out-of-town excursion in the last few days, it has a funny look to it. It has the look of an offshore balancer getting the littoral powers in a row to deal with the coming problem, which most people would say is China, right? So I have a sense that there are other people who might have a different view of where the priorities should lie over the long term. But in the intermediate term, I think, you know, as people like to say about these wars, where we are is where we are. And I think what you'll see is, at best, is a commitment to the president's vision of a slow, deliberate, but real path out of this country, right? And from my point of view, I consider it to be a waste of lives and money. That's my personal view. And I'm puzzled on strategic grounds that the administration doesn't see that. On domestic political grounds, I can see the interest, but it makes me sad to think that so much money and so many lives will be wasted on what I suspect is mainly a domestic political problem. It makes me sad.
We'll go to this side, but only if it's not for Barry, because reading his body language made it very clear. He's
No, there are smart people in this family. Afghanistan is what Afghanistan is.
Yes, sir.
This question is for Mr. Johnson.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Lawrence Bariner. I'm an undergraduate here at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And I actually have a paper due very shortly for public policy. And so the topic for the paper is experts. And so, Mr. Johnson, just concerning what you mentioned about how we had an opportunity to kind of, you know, punish these guys who were taking all this risk and then who eventually ended up getting bailed out for it, and now are undermining any possibility that we have to change this system. How far do you see this going before we have another opportunity to change this system? Are we going to have to go through another recession? Where do you think this is going to land as far as us being able to change this eventually?
I think it's a great question. I think you have to have one of two possible things happen. First of all, you could have a political leader emerge who was sort of like Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, who decides to take on the massive industrial and railroad trust, which was totally against the odds, rather out of the blue in intellectual terms, and he was way ahead of the experts on that issue. And, you know, over a 10-year period, the consensus massively shifted as a result of his actions against those kinds of huge companies with all the concentrated economic and political power they had. Or you have to have an FDR-type moment. You have to have a crisis. You have to have a moment where you can cut through. You know, I think Jake said it best in terms of the web of power around an issue, the distributional consequences in a political system like the United States. If you feel like you're going to be adversely impacted by a policy and you have a lot of money, you can defend your position, and you will defend it in all kinds of ways. And of course, the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court makes it even easier to spend a lot of money defending, defeating the people who are trying to reform an issue. So you only get to break through there when something really bad happens and people say, wow, this is totally out of control. But of course, those moments can go very badly too. There's no guarantee you get sensible reform. FDR's big reforms were 5, 6 years after the Great Crash. And they come in the middle of a huge depression. Nobody wants a Great Depression. But I fear that we will have to have it will only be in a moment of crisis that we really confront either the issues I'm talking about or the environmental issues, actually.
Jake, do you want to add something to that?
Well, one of the problems with the climate is that it doesn't come in short, sharp shocks. It comes in changes over decades, and the difficulty is that the greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere have lifetimes of century, and so they're essentially on human timescales for permanent. And the process of adjustment to that is slow, but inexorable, I believe. But in the short run, where you might get a shock, it is a very noisy system. So my view about looking for a shock to bring concern for the climate issue is, my metaphor for that is that he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So you do get a drought, an extra hot summer in France, and if you claim that's climate change, and you know that every time there is such an event, it's always in the paper, well, there it is, it's climate change. The problem is that the climate is variable in the short run, and 6 months later, it's snowing for 3 weeks in Washington, and they're building Al Gore snow huts and stuff. So that is the nature. The nature of the problem is different. You don't get you might get action in a kind of a crisis, but the notion that we will look for a serious drought or a big flood or something to kind of change the politics. This issue is more difficult than that in terms of the types of events that it presents. We're not going to get those, I don't think, over time. Now, it is possible over longer periods of time, over a decade. I mean, we have a situation where the Arctic ice is gradually disappearing. Serious things are happening, and it could be that these longer-term changes the fact of these could finally sink into people, and there are things happening that are consistent with climate change over long periods of time that people would begin to recognize and could become more concerned about. But the notion of something that's the equivalent of a banking crisis, that I think is not. I don't think looking for that is not an effective way to think about how to deal with this issue.
Yes, sir.
My name is Paolo Raffinetti, and I'm a visiting student from the Swiss Institute of Technology. May I still ask a question to Professor Posen?
You may.
Thank you. My question is about Pakistan. You said that Pakistan is a big player in the stability of Afghanistan. Now, my question is, how ponderated a decision was the one of asking Mr. Musharraf to leave his government presidency, I don't know how to call it, of Pakistan and call in elections?
I'm not an expert in Pakistani politics, so I really can't answer your question. I don't know if things would have been worse or better, right? It seems to me that he was unusually adept at giving us a little bit of what we wanted and not everything that we wanted. And I think the subsequent governments have been just as adept at giving us a little of what we want, but not everything that we want. I think the power centers that are there and are problematical for us have been relatively consistent over time, which is to say the Army and the Army's intelligence services. So I think that's the core, and whether or not shifting horses as far as Musharraf was concerned made a big dent in that, I really am not competent to comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Carolyn Arend, and I served with an NGO, American Friends Service Committee, in Vietnam, so I count myself as a veteran. I appreciate your expertise, but I think we're on the wrong track. Obama challenged us right off the bat. He can't do anything without the rest of us behind him. And if we're behind, war is the answer, then that's what we get. And if we're behind babysitting banks instead of getting jobs for people in the coal mining areas to plant trees like they did in the CCC days of World War II after the Depression, there are a lot of creative visions that we can demand, but we have to do that. And I appreciate your expertise, but I think we have to look at ourselves as well.
Is there a
This is
question?
to everybody.
Anyone want to respond?
Sounds right.
Look, I think that's entirely right with regard to the financial sector, but remember that remember how upset and how confused people become. I mean, I vote, but I don't vote in Massachusetts, and somebody voted for Scott Brown in January of this year. There was an interesting and surprising reaction to the feeling that the administration wasn't delivering. So where is the process that produces coherence on this vision? Where's the political leadership, the people who step up and say, look, can you go this way or can you go that way? There are certainly new ideas out there. Many of them are incoherent. Some of them are downright dangerous. There's a groundswell, and some of them are backed by huge amounts of corporate money, by the way, and some of them are backed by foreign money, in case you didn't notice. All right? But those are the ideas. That's the groundswell. Those people are angry with good reason. This administration missed the moment to tap that anger and to channel that into what I would regard as constructive, responsible policy. And you might not feel that was sufficiently creative, and you'd probably be right. But that is where I'm coming from. They missed that totally. All right? And of course people are angry. People should be angry. But the way that anger has now got channeled and picked up is going to make things much more difficult in all these dimensions.
Well, I don't know how many of you have read 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortensen, but I think he has a good message. I mean, folks in Afghanistan cry at their weddings because once they go to the other village, they'll never be able to come home. There are no bridges.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Lawrence Perlman. I'm just a resident here in Cambridge, and I'd like to thank you all. I actually have a question. I would have a question for all 3 gentlemen, but I think I'll just hold myself to 2 questions regarding banking and the environment, also climate change. With regard to banking, and this is just basically a hypothetical, is there any negative that you can say in our financial system today here in this country to just going back to the Glass-Steagall Act, or the equivalent of that, whatever it may be called in the future, basically trying to eliminate the moral hazard that is such a big part of our financial system right now? And with regard to the climate change, my question is, how much of what we can do here in America actually matters internationally when we have China, excuse me, such a bulge of carbon dioxide and monoxide coming from China in the future when they have all their power plants, and as much as they may be using nukes, they'll be relying on coal for a long time. Thank you.
So I'll start with the banking question, which is a very good question and exactly on target. The Glass-Steagall Act of the 1930s was an attempt to, a successful attempt actually, to separate the more risk-taking, aggressive parts of banking from the somewhat potentially more boring, vanilla parts of banking. And it worked for 40, going on 50 years. And I would say going back to the spirit of Glass-Steagall is a very good idea. I don't think you can rebuild exactly that structure. We could talk about why separately. But I think that founding idea is exactly the right way to proceed. And there were ideas on the table in some competing visions of what the Dodd-Frank legislation would do, that would have pushed banks very much in that direction. And there have been other opportunities, particularly with regard to how much capital banks should have, to again move the banks in that safer direction. But all those opportunities have been missed by this administration. Now, there have been very strong lobbies also insisting that those be missed, and it's a distributional effect, where distributional effects are on a relatively few, it's not on the whole of West Virginia, it's on a relatively few people at the top of Wall Street. But those people have a lot of money and great political advice, and they play this game better than anyone that I've met. So those opportunities don't come that often, unfortunately, and almost all of those opportunities were squandered this time around.
Jake.
I guess on the second question, let me establish for the audience just the numbers here. I mean, of total greenhouse gas emissions now, the United States is somewhat less than a quarter, and China is somewhat less than a quarter. So we add up to a lot of the issue. And China is growing rapidly, and they're building a lot of coal-fired power. So ultimately, this problem is not solved without participation by China, but not only China, but Brazil and India and Indonesia and South Africa and a number of other countries. But so that the notion that if the United States does it all by itself, do we achieve it if China doesn't participate? No, but that's not the right question. The question is, how do you get started along a path? And the United States is not going to go to some huge level of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions all by itself. It will do that if other countries come along, and you need to get on a path where you find those ways where countries can move together. And so the problem is for the United States to take some initial action that puts us in a position to even be in the discussion about what kinds of overall larger international arrangements might be made. So we really can't participate in that discussion in the state that we're in now. The other thing I have to say is that for China and for a number of other countries, if we're going to get to the kind of reductions we're ultimately going to need, given the difference in the income levels between our countries, then richer countries like ours and some other countries are going to have to come to the point where they're willing to make some financial transfers to those countries as well. It's going to take a long time to get there, but we don't get there unless we get started. And the situation I was describing was one where we're not now even able to make the first step that puts us seriously into the discussion. In Copenhagen, when we had this meeting and they came up with an accord, the CEOs of not CEOs, the heads of state of these countries were there. And Wen Jiabao, who's the president, or maybe that's not the right term, one of the leaders in China, Chinese leader there, was having a meeting with a group of developing countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, and company. And a private meeting, and Obama barged into his meeting to try to, and ultimately that kind of a two and a half page voluntary agreement was worked out. It's the only thing that came out of that meeting, as if the United States was a player at that level, us and China and these other countries. But after what's taking place in the last year and what the situation is now, we're no longer even a player at that level to be in that discussion, which we don't even get started, I'm afraid.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so I'm a sophomore, double majoring in mechanical engineering and brain and cognitive science. My name is Ranjita Bharat. My question is for Professor Jacoby. So I understand that you think that the current administration doesn't have enough bandwidth left to deal with climate change sufficiently, but what would you suggest the first few steps should be for the next administration?
Of a new administration?
Yeah, the next, after this Obama administration.
What you can imagine a new administration would reasonably do is heavily conditioned by what you think the Congress is that comes with them. But I think that a new administration ought to start where we ended up. That is, a new administration ought to collect the compromises that were there in the existing House and Senate bills, messy as they were, and come up with a proposal in the area of a cap-and-trade system with various kinds of compensations for the losers, and to push that again. That's what I think a new administration should do. It only is reasonable for them to do that if they have support in the Congress.
So just on that point, my expectation is the Senate, whatever happens in 2012, the Senate will go Republican. There are 23, it's mostly driven by how many seats are up from which side. There are 23 Democratic seats up. It would take, it's not hard to imagine how President Obama gets reelected. It's very hard to see how the Democrats hold the Senate. So I think, or certainly getting filibuster-proof majority, that must be inconceivable, actually. So I think feeding into your issues, that cannot be encouraging.
Except that if you look over the history of the United States, the climate issue, when you're not really trying to destroy a particular president, is not necessarily so purely a party issue. The issue is heavily a regional issue. And if you look back at the history of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in the 70s, the Clean Air Act improvements in the 1990s, they were all passed in Republican administrations. It's not necessarily a Democrat-Republican issue. A lot of the problem in dealing with this is it's essentially the coasts versus the middle of the country. And heavily, there are 22 states that produce coal. There are states that are more dependent on oil and more dependent on coal and coal-fired power. And I'll point out that California has, that California turned back an attempt to repeal their very tough law. They have support for this in California. There's a lot of support in the West Coast. We have a cap-and-trade system in the eastern states. So it's a regional problem, and it's not impossible if you can somehow get out of the way, get this out of the party-to-party discussion. The issue of the fact of the government taking a heavier intervention into markets and the ideology behind that and the kind of Tea Party view of that, that's tougher. Whether that survives or grows is a big question of whether or not we could get out of this confrontation as a party question rather than solving the regional distributional problems in the country.
I think we have time for two more. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ethan Bates. I'm a graduate student here at MIT. I have a question for Professor Jacoby. You previously spoke about how with the issue of climate change, we don't really have a short, sharp shove that we're going to see immediately. It's going to be a gradual change. But with respect to the oil spill, do you believe that Obama could have framed that issue in a more revealing way as to the externalities and the problems that we have with our oil dependence?
Well, I suppose he might have tried to do that. I don't know. In the process, they were so absorbed in trying to deal with the issue day to day to try to make a political move on that basis against fossil fuels, for example. I don't know. This is sort of beyond my pay grade in terms of political strategy, but I'm not surprised they didn't do that, given their absorption and even just trying to deal with the issue as it came at them.
I think that this, if I may, that this is I agree that tactically they weren't ready. I mean, a lot of this is, do you have the right mental model when these opportunities arise or disasters arise? But what the United States does, to be clear, is we run a big current account deficit. We spend more than we earn relative to the rest of the world, and we finance that. And much of that current account deficit is imported oil. We finance that by selling treasury bills to China, which, if it sounds like a nonsensical scheme, that's because you just understood it correctly, right? And this is a huge strategic national security issue, I think, not that it's accepted as such by the national security establishment. Those things are usually seen as in different compartments. But I think that the right message exactly to take on oil in particular is that importing as much oil as we do creates a massive vulnerability, including our relationship with the Middle East, including our relationship with China. It's completely unnecessary. If you were to have a carbon tax that you phased in over 20 years, for example, you would directly address that issue. Now, I understand that's not on the political agenda. That's why we're supposed to have leaders. They're supposed to shape the agenda and seize the moments. But the dependence on imported oil and the macroeconomic consequences of that, including continuing to borrow and continue to increase our debt relative to the rest of the world, including China, it's absolutely an important vulnerability for this country going forward.
But there you run into the irony. Is one of the ways to solve that problem is to drill more in the Gulf.
And to mine more coal.
Yes.
And to mine more coal. I mean, or to fracture more underground for gas.
Yep.
I mean, you can't tell where these arguments are going to end up is the problem. Right?
give this gentleman the last question.
We've heard advice as to what a future administration might do on climate legislation. Why is not this administration and this Senate leadership now in this Congress bringing forward some legislation to salvage what was already done in the House and could be reconciled with something coming out of the Senate? Can nothing like this be done? And if so, if it could be, why isn't it being done? Or does this make no sense?
One of the great and most effective leaders on this issue in the last 6 or 7 years has been Senator John McCain. And the early cap and trade bills were Lieberman-McCain, going back to 2003, 2004. He was a great leader on this issue. He was attacked from the right on this question, on the kinds of distributional grounds and ideological grounds, and he completely abandoned the issue. So the politics of this has been very unfortunate, I think, in the election, both on the grounds I said, a kind of ideology and role of the government and such, but also there's a huge amount of campaign money to support people who argue that this is a fraud. I mean, what kind of or a conspiracy. So there's a huge amount of support. Has been a large amount of support for people who want to deny this issue completely. And it is the political fight on the two issues that I talked about before. And my view is comes back to the I don't see the lady who asked the question about why don't we change, but I think that the Congress will be responsive to the attitudes and of the public. I mean, that's a sort of liberal thing to say, but I sort of believe that. and if we had stronger support from publics about that, you'd get more out of the Congress, as you do in California, for example, where you do have this kind of public support. And so that's why I emphasize a concern that the administration sort of game up the bully pulpit on this, of teaching people and keeping this issue up and being willing to stand up for it in various circumstances, because that's the only way we're going to get this issue changed in the Congress, is to somehow not have this be the kind of issue that can be I don't know, an old-fashioned term, mau-mau, that it was in this campaign, that where you had. If you watch the TV ads, not in Massachusetts because it wasn't the issue here, but in other areas where people were attacked politically for supporting the administration on climate change, it became a political issue, and people were attacked on that basis. And you get away with that if people don't understand the issue. Getting the concern down on things like whether you're going to lose your house helps. But I think that. There are lots of organizations out there that are trying to educate people, NGOs and academics, and we all give talks and we do all this. But I think symbolic leadership from the top is important, and I wish we'd had more of it.
Well, we'll leave it at that, but please join me in thanking our speakers. And please join us for refreshments outside. Thank you very much for coming.
Mau-mau.
What's that from?
Kenya? Kenya.
No, but what was, yeah, I know the Kenya.
Well, mau-mau is, we kill people. Mau-mau is it.
Oh, I see.